Yesterday we started with Gordon Allport worrying about the self and arguing that it's easier to feel the self than to define the self. And we began to talk about what the self looks like from a cognitive point of view. And what I want to do today is to continue with this general idea of the self as a mental representation of oneself. That's basically all there is to it. We talked last time about two different views of the mental representation of the self. The self is a concept, a list of features or something like that, that distinguishes oneself from other people, or the self is image, kind of analog-based representation that represents the physical features of the self. And what I want to do today is to turn mostly to a third view of the mental representation of the self, which is simply to think about the self as a knowledge structure that is that's stored in memory. Representation of the self in memory, much like we represent our knowledge about other people in memory. So again, you think about the self as a memory structure, the general idea here is that we've got some verbal propositional knowledge about the self, propositional type statements that describe the self, either with respect to episodic memories, representations of specific episodes in the person's life, specific actions or experiences, or semantic self-knowledge, that is, representations of the person's more or less enduring characteristics, whether they're physical characteristics or psychological characteristics or social characteristics. All this should be familiar to you because we talked about this exact view before when we talked about person memory, social memory, that is, how we represent knowledge about other people in memory. And you'll remember our example was this knowledge about James Bartlett, professor at the University of Texas in Dallas, who is kind and thoughtless. That's semantic knowledge about James Bartlett that we might have. And that he rescued the kitten and that he caused the accident. That's episodic knowledge about James Bartlett that we had. But I want to add something new here, which is that's what James Bartlett looks like. Okay? So even though we talk about verbal propositional representations of knowledge, there's no reason why there couldn't be a link from the node that represents this person, James Bartlett, to some node-like structure that represents what this guy looks like. So that's a schematic of my mental representation of James Bartlett, somebody that I know. What would it look like if we got inside James Bartlett's head and looked at his mental representation of himself? Well, it would look like that. Okay, you'd have this node that represents the self, and James Bartlett's knowledge that he's a kind person and that he is thoughtless, and his memory that he rescued the kitten and that he caused the accident. We'll add that his name is James Bartlett. That's something he knows about himself, and he also knows that he looks like this. And if you were looking very carefully, you'll notice that this is a mirror reversed image of the one I showed you before, because this is how he sees himself when he gets up in the morning and shaves in front of the mirror. But the general idea is that the structure of James Bartlett's self in memory looks an awful lot like the structure of my mental representation of James Bartlett in my memory. And again, just to kind of review the beginning for a while, one of the things that has concerned people who are studying both our memory representations of other people and our memory representations of ourselves has to do with how episodic and semantic self-knowledge are organized with respect to each other. This is what we call the independence view of the self, where there's a node representing the self, and then there are these associative links out to nodes representing other kinds of self-knowledge, some of them being pieces of semantic self-knowledge, like the self is neurotic, and the self is extroverted, and also episodic knowledge, like there was an occasion where I felt tense and jittery, or went to pieces under stress, or liked the stranger, or wanted to be with others, or whatever. This is the model that seems to be suggested by research that we conduct in person memory, that is mental representations of other people, but you'll remember from those lectures that there are other possibilities. So for example, there's a hierarchical view of the self where the self is connected directly to nodes that represent semantic self-knowledge, that the self is a neurotic extrovert, and then these nodes representing semantic self-knowledge are themselves connected to other nodes that represent episodes in the person's life that exemplify the generic characteristics, the traits that are in question. So feeling tense and jittery, that's an episode of neurosis. Going to pieces under stress, that's an episode of neurosis. Liking a stranger, that's an episode of extroversion, and so on. Now there's a third view, which I talked about very briefly when we discussed person memory. I just want to touch base with it right now, which is what you might call a computational view of the self. This is the view that is implied by a famous theory in social psychology known as self-perception theory, which basically says that we don't carry around in our heads any semantic self-knowledge. We don't carry around in our heads knowledge about our attitudes and our beliefs and our traits or anything like that. What we do is, when we're asked what our attitude is, we compute what our attitude must be based on knowledge that we have about how we behaved in the past. So, for example, if I'm completing a personality self-rating scale and I come upon the question that says, how neurotic are you? I cast my mind back on previous episodes in my life and I determine how often I felt tense and jittery, how often I've gone to pieces under stress. If I'm asked how extroverted I am, I cast my mind back to my previous episodes of life and determine how often it's been that I actually met a stranger and liked them right off the bat, or how often I wanted to be with other people, or so on. Notice that trait self-knowledge isn't represented here at all. That's why it's called a computational view of self, because the idea is that when you're asked about what you're like in general, you kind of compute an answer to that question online based on the retrieval of various episodes in memory. Now, you'll remember from the lectures on person memory that evidence overwhelmingly favors the independence view of self, the idea that the independence view of person memory, the idea that semantic and episodic knowledge about other people are represented independently. Now, if you thought, as I've been arguing, at least implicitly, that the self is just another person represented in memory, with the exception being that the person is you as opposed to somebody else, well, then you'd expect the self to look like this as well. You'd expect that trait information like neurotic and extroverted would be represented in memory independently of episodic information like felt tense and jittery or wanted to be with others or whatever. So let's see if that's actually the case. Okay, these are just a comparison of the three different models for mental representations of self in memory. The first kind of evidence that bears on this is evidence from priming effects in self-judgments. And again, this is work by Stanley Klein at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who has done more than anybody else to kind of argue for this independence view of self-knowledge. And in a series of studies, Klein and his colleagues have made use of this priming paradigm, which you should be familiar with by now. Priming is simply a phenomenon where the performance of one task facilitates performance on some other task. There's positive priming, where one task facilitates performance. There's also negative priming, where the first task impairs performance on the second task. Negative priming is something we're not going to discuss here. It's A, too complicated, B, it doesn't matter for purposes of this discussion, and third, you will tear your hair out getting negative priming effects. Do not try this at home, right? These are very difficult to get. So what Klein did with respect to self-knowledge is exactly what he and his colleagues had done with respect to our knowledge about other people stored in memory. He presented subjects with trait adjectives like neurotic and extroverted, under three conditions. In the first, he asked subjects simply whether the trait was characteristic of themselves. So the word neurotic appears on the computer screen, and subjects have to press a button that indicates whether that trait is part of their self-concept or not. In the second condition, subjects had to recall an autobiographical memory in which they displayed the trait in question. So again, the word neurotic comes up on the computer screen. Even the most well-adjusted of us here have behaved neurotically at one time or another in our lives. So what the subject has to do is simply recall the time when he was neurotic and then press a button as soon as he's remembered that episode. And then in the third condition, the subjects were simply asked to define the term. So they were asked, does neurotic mean anxious? And then you press a button that says yes or no, as opposed to does neurotic mean happy or something like that. So that's the basic thing. It's just a standard reaction time task. And what Klein was looking for was evidence of repetition priming. So what he wanted to do was to look at the effects of one task on reaction time in the next trial based on the relationship between these trials. So if there actually is priming, you would certainly expect if task one, the first trial, asked the subject to define a trait, then if on the next trial, the subject was asked to define the same trait, you'd get a priming effect. Similarly, for recalling episodes, you'd expect priming within a task, and for describing traits, you'd expect priming within a task. But what Klein was really mostly interested in, was what we might call a kind of semantic priming effect, where there's not a lot of overlap between the tasks. So does recalling a trait-related episode prime self-description judgments? Or does making a self-description judgment prime recalling a trait in memory? And remember, the logic here is, here we go, that if our knowledge about ourselves is organized in this way, asking a subject to make a trait-based judgment about the self should prime recalling trait-based episodes, okay? Because you activate this node and activation spreads down here. At the same time, asking somebody to recall a trait-related episode should prime self-description judgments because the only way to get to the episode is through the trait, okay? So that by the time you get down here, you've already activated the trait node. So if you've got a situation like this, where episodes of behavior are organized by, are subsumed by, they fan out from the traits that they represent, you'd expect to see these kinds of priming effects. And if you remember what Klein got when he looked at person memory, judgments about other people, you know what he got when he looked at self-memory. So here we have the three priming tasks and a control task where there was no priming task, okay? And then we have performance on the target task, and this is response latency, okay, in terms of seconds and milliseconds. So what you can see here is that if you describe yourself on trial 1, there's facilitation in describing yourself on trial 2. That's the priming effect. If you retrieve an autobiographical memory on trial 1, you're primed to retrieve an autobiographical, when you try to retrieve an autobiographical memory on trial 2. If you're simply asked to define the trait on trial 1, there's a priming effect if you're asked to define the same trait again on the immediately succeeding trial. So there are priming effects in this situation, but there aren't the kinds of priming effects that are critical to the question of whether self-knowledge is organized by traits. So for example, describing, where are we here? Okay, retrieving an autobiographical memory doesn't particularly prime self-description judgments, okay? That's the priming effect right there, okay? And for that matter, describing yourself on a particular trait doesn't prime the retrieval of an autobiographical memory related to that trait. So we don't have these kinds of priming effects that you'd expect to see if episodic information was organized by semantic information. Instead, the lack of priming that we observe across tasks, where describing oneself doesn't prime retrieval of autobiographical memory, retrieving an autobiographical memory doesn't prime self-description judgments, is exactly the pattern that we would expect if semantic and episodic, if trait and autobiographical information were represented in memory independently of each other. And that is, in fact, the conclusion of all these studies. There are now a bunch of these studies that have been done, in part because when Klein first published these results, nobody would believe them. Right? They thought, oh, this is a crazy way to organize a memory. That is not to have your memory organized by traits. But every time somebody tries to do this study, they get exactly what Klein got the first time. So there's priming within knowledge categories. There's priming within the category of semantic self-knowledge. Making a trait judgment facilitates making that trait judgment again. There's priming within the category of episodic trait knowledge. Remembering a time when you were neurotic makes it easier to remember a time when you were neurotic on the next trial, but there's no priming across knowledge categories. Performing a semantic self-reference task doesn't facilitate the retrieval of autobiographical memories, and retrieving autobiographical memories doesn't actually facilitate making self-reference judgments. So that's the general idea here. And again, if you remember our discussion, which you should, this was just on the exam, if you remember our discussion from person memory, this should be no surprise. What Klein has also done, however, it's always nice to have converging evidence from several different paradigms. So what Klein has been able to do has been to get additional evidence for the independence of episodic and semantic trait and behavioral self-knowledge from a different kind of paradigm entirely, and that is to say, neuropsychological paradigms involving amnesic patients. The representation of self in amnesia is particularly interesting because amnesic patients, by definition, do not have episodic memory. They don't have memories for particular events and experiences. If you think about the late patient H.M., H.M. had an operation that excised large portions of his medial temporal lobes in 1953. He just died in 2009. And for that entire period of time, some 55 years, H.M. had absolutely no memory of anything he did or anything that had happened to him or anything that happened in the world. So what happens in amnesia is that you don't have episodic self-knowledge. You don't have any memory, any conscious memory anyway, for specific episodes of behavior or experience. Now, nobody asked this question of H.M., largely because social psychologists and personality psychologists didn't get anywhere near H.M., and the cognitive psychologists who worked with him on a daily basis never thought to ask this question. But the question is, you take an amnesic patient who can't remember any specific episodes of behavior or experience, Does he still have any sense of what he's like as a person? Does an amnesic patient have any knowledge about himself in terms of what his traits and attitudes and behaviors are? Remember that from the point of view of the computational model of the self, if you lose access to your memories, you don't have anything else, because the computational model suggests that we don't actually store generic self-knowledge about our traits and behaviors. We have to compute that information online. Well, when Klein first published his claims about the independence of self and of semantic and episodic self-knowledge, Endel Tolving, who's an important pioneer in the neuropsychology of memory, says, hey, I think I have a way of testing this. Tolving was at this time working with a fairly famous amnesic case known as KC. This is an HM. These guys are always known by their initials. They're almost always known by their initials. KC was a young man who was involved in a motorcycle accident at age 30, and basically he spilled over his handlebars and landed on his head, and as a result of this head injury, displayed a profound amnesia, both a retrograde amnesia that resulted in the loss of personal memories from the period before the accident, and an anterograde amnesia, which simply means that since the accident, he's not been able to lay down any new memories. Now, this kind of brain damage always causes an anterograde amnesia. Okay, the damage to the medial portions of the temporal lobes, hippocampus, and structures like that gives the person an anterograde amnesia, which means that they can't lay down any new episodic memories since the accident. In some cases, this same brain damage will produce a retrograde amnesia. And what was interesting about the case of KC is that his retrograde amnesia was so extensive that it covered his entire life. That is, after the accident, Casey had absolutely no ability to recollect anything that he had ever experienced, anything that he had ever done for his entire life. It wasn't one of these nice temporally graded things where you lose a couple of hours or a couple of days or a couple of weeks. I'll show you such a case in a minute. He lost everything. Moreover, it turns out that as a result of the accident, and presumably as a result of other brain damage that he suffered, Casey underwent a personality change. Before his accident, what's known as your premorbid personality, before your illness, he was very extroverted. That's why he was riding a motorcycle without a helmet in the first place. Okay. After the accident, however, Casey became very introverted, very withdrawn, not angry or anything like that, just very shy and ill at ease about people. So the question that Tolving posed, based on a reading of Klein's article, is, hey, what about Casey? Casey doesn't remember anything about what he's done in his life. He doesn't remember riding a motorcycle without a helmet. He doesn't remember any of the other extroverted things that he did. Does Casey have any appreciation of what he's like as a person? Does Casey have any appreciation now that he's introverted as opposed to extroverted or whatever? So Tolving did the following really interesting study in which he went to Casey with an adjective checklist and simply asked Casey to rate what his personality was like. Now remember, this is really quite an extraordinary thing to ask an amnesic patient to do, especially one like Casey, who can't remember anything he's ever done in his life. Can't remember any specific episode in his life, to say, what do you like? Okay, and in addition, what Tolving asked Casey to do was to rate what he was like before his accident and what he's like now. And then Tolving went to Casey's mother, who was still around, and asked her to rate what Casey was like before his accident and what he's like now. The data's a little complicated, but I'm going to present you the salient points. So here we have ratings of Casey's postmorbid personality. Remember, before the accident, he was kind of extroverted. Now, since the accident, he's quite introverted. And if you compare Casey's ratings of himself versus his mother's rating of what he's like, you get a very high correlation. Q is a special kind of correlation that Tolving used for particular purposes. We don't have to get into that. But like any correlation coefficients range from -1, meaning there's a perfect negative association between two variables, through 0, a random association, to +1, meaning there's a perfect positive association between two variables. 0.77 is pretty high for a correlation coefficient. There's actually quite good correspondence between Casey's rating of himself now and his mother's rating of himself right now. Casey seems to have a pretty good idea of what he's like as a person, despite the fact that he can't remember anything that's happened to him since the accident, or for that matter, before the accident. And just as a comparison, Casey was asked to rate what his mother was like as a person, and she was asked to rate what she was like as a person, and you also got a very high correlation. So Casey is able to rate accurately the personality of some other person, and he's actually able to rate his own as well. Here's a little bit more detail when Tolving compared Casey's premorbid to his postmorbid personality. And what you got here, first, he asked Casey to rate what he's like now as a person, his postmorbid personality, on 2 separate occasions, and those 2 ratings showed a very high level of agreement, about 76%. So Casey's not just guessing, and he didn't just happen to guess right the first time, he's actually making reliable judgments about himself. Casey's mother's ratings of his pre-morbid personality versus his post-morbid personality showed only about 50% agreement. And the way this data was collected with 2 alternative forced choice responses, that is simply a chance. He's a very different person now than he was then. Casey's rating of what he's like now versus his mother's rating of what he was like now, again, very high levels of